Okay. Well, let's move on. Next up, Jonathan Fisher from the New York RDC. Share some of his experience with it.
So yeah, I had a couple of things I thought would be interesting. It's one to continue what Charlie and Justin were talking about, of give you an example of someone who was creative. There's a project that has a working paper now. They brought in confidential vital statistics data on birth. So they knew where the mother lived when she was pregnant, when she had the child. So the outcomes they want to look at are low birth weight or child mortality. And they are matching it to the longitudinal business database and to EPA data on toxic release of pollutants. And so they're looking at when a plant closes or when a plant opens, they see, the plant opens, what happened to incidence of low birth weight around, for births that occurred around that plant, or when the plant closed, what happened to incidence of low birth weight. So they're bringing in this outside data for part of the project. It's something obviously that you could not do with just the vital statistics data. You needed to get the plants opening and closing. You needed to bring in bring in outside data and match it to the longitudinal business database. So that's another creative way of not just using census data, but bringing in your own. And Justin made me remember that there is a poorly titled data set that just became available. It's called the National Longitudinal Mortality Study. And if you ask me what a longitudinal mortality study is, I'm not sure. But I'll tell you why I believe they named it that. It is the current population survey, which has been ongoing, I think, it's been ongoing since the 60s, but I think they have these snapshots from the current population survey from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and I think up to the early 2000s. And then, so we have information on the Social Security number, name of the person. Then if that person dies, we have the public records, and census matches it, and so you then have this information from someone who was in the CPS in 1984, died in 1992, and so that's what the longitudinal aspect is. Technically, we have two observations for the person: one when they're in the CPS, and then one when they died. And so you then have information from the death certificate on cause of death. And if you do that sort of research, you can look up the National Longitudinal Mortality Study, and it has a fairly good information on fairly good code book on what would be available in the RDC. Then the other thing I thought would be good to talk about is if you're interested in a census proposal and using census data, there are three criteria that I really think about that census wants in a proposal. So you need to write down a detailed proposal, what data you want to access. And there are, I think, three things that census wants from it. First, do you need restricted access data? So can this be done with public use? Obviously, that is usually easy to answer and say yes, you do need it. But you need to have a sentence or two in there that says this cannot be done with public use data. Census just likes having that in there. So that one is easy. The second is you need to have a project. Census needs to know whether the project is feasible. So you need to say what data sets you want, what years, and what variables from the data set. None of us, you don't want it, we don't want it. We don't want to approve a project, and you don't want to start a project and then find out a year later that it's not feasible. So that's why you need to do the background work, look at the questionnaire, see what variables are actually in the data and what is feasible with the data. So you need to discuss the data and then what you want to do with the data as well. What are your dependent variables? What are your independent variables going to be? So is it feasible? Do you need restricted use data? And then lastly, could there be a potential disclosure risk from your project? And so are we going to protect the confidentiality of the data? And so that's why you will talk about what are your samples going to be. Are you going to look at rural single mothers? We need to make sure that the samples are going to be large enough. And so you need to discuss those things. And so what Justin was saying and what he did for his is look at the public use data. And that's what I had a project that wanted to look at the survey of income and program participation. And I was a little worried about samples. She wanted to look at the implementation of the WIC program and how that affected earnings later in life. So WIC was implemented in the early 70s. if you were born in a county with WIC versus 2 years later, or you were born in a county before WIC was implemented. How did the implementation of WIC affect later life outcomes? And I was really worried about the sample sizes because she was really looking at a short window. And so she looked at the public use data and found out, with the public use data, this is my guess of how many observations I'm going to have. And so that's how you can help address, is the project going to present a disclosure, a potential disclosure risk. So those are really the three criteria that Census, the main ones that Census is looking at when they're reviewing proposals.
Do we have questions off of this? I know some questions that I've fielded just by email and a couple of phone calls. So I know that some people have been interested in what I would call policy-oriented research, where they would like to get essentially some neat tabulations out, particularly for their needs. And there's not a comparable tabulation available in published materials. And while the Census Bureau does produce all kinds of tabulations, they don't always slice the data the way that somebody might want to. Okay. Are projects of that sort going to be very feasible under the disclosure rules?
So I think where it becomes complicated is that there's sort of primary disclosure and then there's secondary disclosure, right? Where you're looking at, we've published, cells in other tables or suppressed cells in other tables, and now we have to look at, we're going to publish yet another table. We have to look at all the pattern of disclosure that we've done. So the Census Bureau program areas have big complicated systems that sort of keep track of where the cell suppressions have been made. And that's just something that we're not equipped to deal with at CES. So that's why lots of tabular output is discouraged. We have a disclosure review board, and things like that would definitely have to be passed through them. And if that was one of the, we do have a level of specificity that we expect from sort of the output section of the project. And if a lot of it is just sort of model-based output, even at detail, where you're looking at like detailed geography, but using models, then that's probably going to fly. If it's, big tabulations with thousands of cells, that's probably going to raise a red flag.
And there are ways, if all you want is just tabulations, you can ask the Census Bureau to do the special tabulations, and they will tell you, rather than doing it yourself. If it's purely tabs and nothing model-based, it is unlikely the project is going to get approved. I don't want to say it will not, but it's highly unlikely that CES would want to host that kind of project or be willing to host that project.
So hypothetically,
okay,
some planners from Houston called and said, we need this tabulation. I should route them to an office at the census to see about a special tabulation. They shouldn't be thinking about this resource.
So I don't know how often this happens on the demographic and decennial side, but I know that the first thing someone on the business side would do is call us up and ask if we could do the special tab, because they just don't have time to do it, right? Like they have like an industry series and a geography series, and they've done all of their work and now they're off to the next thing. Someone wants to come and publish something else and they're like, well, we don't have time, can you do it? And we usually say, we don't do it because we're not set up to handle that. And then usually what they do is quote you a price that's so absurdly high that you're just like, forget it. So not to be completely discouraging about it, but I think that the special tabs thing is pretty hard.
The question that I always come back to for the researchers is to say, why do you need special tabs? Many times we're so stuck in this way of thinking that the way we do our work is to take this census data and that's published and massage it and do something with it. And now we need this to do it the way we want to do it, we need this different table to massage it so that we can do something different with it. we need to get people to think about what would you do if you were getting your outcome. The outcome is usually not the table. The outcome is usually something else. How could you get the outcome directly from the microdata? We had a group that came in to me and said, we wanted this tabulation. Why did you want, well, we can't give you a tabulation. Why do you want it? Oh, we do these detailed population forecasts. Okay. Do the forecast from the microdata. Forecasts are something that have no disclosure risk whatsoever, because they're driven off of, they may be driven off of a tabulation that's internal and confidential, but they're forecasts. They're guesstimates of what the world would look like. There's nothing that would prevent a group from doing that. They just get it so much in their head that they need this tabulation because they're used to using and used to thinking about using published data sources, that they can't change their way of thinking about doing it a different way. And so when someone says, I need a tabulation, the first question you ask them is, why do you need it? What do you want to do with it? Because most people don't just want the tabulation, they want what they're going to do with it. And there may be ways to do that, to get the result directly from the microdata that would be amenable to a census project.
That's a good point.
My question is about...
Share your name with us, please.
Yeah, my name is Miriam Olivares. I'm with Texas A&M Libraries. For the household data, I hear that you can link to IRS or even W-2. Does the center have the data in a way that is with identifiers, and I don't need to worry about identifying the individuals, so I don't need to worry about IRB, or is absolutely open? And I just wanted to learn, because I cannot picture seeing someone's social security number, or, I just wanted to learn, is it replaced by an identifier?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so IRB...
We have something what we call a protected identification key. Yeah. And it can be assigned in a number of ways. When SSA, so I get a little confused when people start talking about W-2s, because this is usually coming from the Social Security Administration. I think that for the SIP program, they're getting administrative data for everyone, but W-2 data from SSA, but only for the people that have been selected in SIP, right? And then they can sort of track, keep the admin data going, even though the person has fallen out of the survey. So those things are all linked together, but you'll never see a Social Security number inside of a research data center. If you have data that has Social Security numbers on it, it's going to have to pass through another process before you can use it inside the research data center. And that process is, it depends. So if it's a security number that's, validated, where you basically know that the number is truly assigned to that person, there are lots of self-reported Social Security numbers that can probably just be wrong. And SSA requires that this identifier be validated. So the way that we do that is we actually have a file called the Numinate file, which is basically the Social Security Administration's list of SSNs and all of the people that, so their name, their address, and their date of birth. And what we can do is take the SSN and some other piece of information and basically validate that person and that it matches with that Social Security number. So that's one data quality check of something that's coming in that SSA requires us to do. And it's also, a measure that the researcher may find interesting, like how many of these things are wrong. So, but the other way that can be used is, suppose that Social Security numbers aren't reported, we can also assign one of these numeric identifiers by matching sort of name, Social Security number, address information, right? We just need multiple pieces of information. And then we can put a numeric identifier so that the matching, essentially, of the data sets is easy at that point, because it's just matching two numbers together. So
they'll use the, was it PIC? PIC? Personal
PIK.
PIK? are those going to be routinely available that you could count on that for matching people across data sets, or how special is that?
That's what I used to find my new employers. Just pick.
So it's
And the same pick could be carried over to another business data set like the survey business owners.
So multiple statistical agencies are including this in their files?
No, it only exists within the Census Bureau. So in fact, there's only 5 people at the Census Bureau that have access to both the SSN and the PIC in the same place. So it's okay to have SSN somewhere, it's okay to have PICs other places, but almost no one can have both of them together except for the people that actually do the process. So that's because that's even more, they don't want anyone to sort of know what the concordance between those things are.
Well, you've got the microphone. We'll get one to you.
Okay, my question was simple. Given that you're talking about all this confidentiality, have you had issues with getting your projects to IRB at your universities?
You don't have access.
You don't have to go through?
You do not, because for household data, you don't have a name, address, or social security number. It's all been de-identified.
Well, we have to go through IRB for de-identified data routinely here anyway.
Researchers at Columbia routinely have me give them a letter that says this person has access to the data, it's de-identified, they have special sworn status, they're sworn to protect the confidentiality of the data, and that is usually sufficient. I don't know. IRB is idiosyncratic, but it is, yes, it should not be a problem.
Yeah, we have similar problem, Baylor. It only hits me on the proposal routing process when I'm doing a grant. At any other time, I don't mess with the IRB, but they're used to me now. Once every
strike that from the record.
Yeah.
So in other words, you have to educate them sort of about this process.
And then I'm the only internal. Well, there are only a couple of internal data users where I am, and so yeah, it's pretty much every time.
And I would say just briefly too that we've gone through the process a couple of times, and it's fairly streamlined through NCHS as well. We get exempt through our IRBs by just providing them essentially a letter like that says this is no different. Essentially, the data that I'm looking at is essentially no different than de-identified data that I could have in my office, because I don't see anything that identifies respondents.
Carson Minkin, Baylor University. Could you speak briefly about the dissemination process? I'm in the lab. I've run my results. I've got a great model. I just can't run off and submit those to a journal, correct?
Correct.
Okay, moving on.
Did you really want to get something out?
Well, how long does it take? I mean, what's the process?
I think that we should get an official answer.
Okay. So you have to provide statistics behind what we call disclosure avoidance statistics behind each statistic that you want to release. So it's really for household data, it's the number of people or households that are behind each statistic, and you have to have a minimum. I can't tell you the minimum, that's confidential. But when you get
it's not that bad.
When you get special sworn status, I can tell it to you. When your project is approved, it's not as if you have some target is unknown. It's after your project is approved, you have special sworn status. You can learn the number.
But we discussed the junior faculty,
right.
Timeline that you can be concerned about.
Right. So,
how long does this disclosure process take? An average time?
Well, we tell researchers it takes on average about 3 weeks. It depends on the quality of work you do beforehand and how much you talk with me beforehand. If you just send me an email and say, I want these files released, and that's the first time I hear about it, and this is the first time you're asking for release, it's probably going to take longer. It's going to take longer than 3 weeks. But I had a researcher, graduate student, who was very organized, told me exactly what was in each model. She rounded some sample sizes to make it easier on us. So it was a rounded sample size instead of the actual number. And when your sample is in the millions, who really cares if it's between 1.1 million and 1.2 million? It's so rounded sample sizes. She was very detailed. She gave me the disclosure avoidance statistics, and she got output in a week. So it depends on how well you work with the administrator and what type of output. Model-based output is very easy because it's just regression coefficients. It's harder to learn something about someone from regression coefficients. Means and things about the actual distribution are harder.
I mean, some things like medians are problematic. So there are ways to create kind of synthetic medians where you're pooling people around the median together to give them some information.
Yes, so the median is about one person, and obviously you can't release a statistic about one person.
So I think a lot of this stuff is sort of well-traveled territory where researchers have figured out ways to kind of deal with the disclosure issues. So.
I just had a question. Oh, and Mark, that is with Texas Transportation Institute. I had a question on: are there certain years, like actual census years, where the data there's more data? So, say I'm talking about crash data, and I can give you a person's, first, last name, date of birth, where they live, their address, and when you're matching it up, if I'm wanting to know specifically, in that year that they're on this table, what their economic status was, or the factors towards their economic status. Mm-hmm. Is there a specific year? Would it be like 2010 is really the only year that I'm going to get, actual data that was collected?
I mean, it really depends. I mean, I think the way to think about it is the more frequent the program, the less information you're going to get, and the smaller the sample is going to be. I mean, that's the rule of thumb on the business side. So if we're publishing monthly data, we basically have a week to collect data, a week to process it, maybe 2 weeks, and then review it and then publish it. I mean, that's a really tight time window. So you're probably talking about 10,000 and firms, not establishments. Quarterly data is probably better, because so the less frequent. And then, when you start getting into the economic census, it's establishment data. It's highly detailed. We're collecting hundreds of items. I think on the equivalent on for decennial, it's a little bit different, right? During the decennial, we used to have the 1 in 6 long form. That went away in 2000. So if you want the detailed information on that side, you really have to go to the American Community Survey now. But now you're talking that there's only a few million households in that survey, right? But it's annual. So, I mean, that's why I think there's also a big push to use administrative data. So the LEHD program, part of the Research and Methodology Directorate has a Center for Administrative Records, Research, and Applications. So they're sort of a clearinghouse to bring lots of administrative data into the Census Bureau as well. Now, there might be some caveats about using some of those in the RDCs. So.
Okay. We're going to move on now to Dr. Zulema Valdez.
Well, I have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well,
clarify what administrative data is for many people that have not. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Sorry. Data that's not actually collected by the Census Bureau, data that's collected by other agencies for other administrative purposes. So lots of the data is collected by the Internal Revenue Service for tax purposes. So, for instance, the longitudinal business database is basically just a linked version of every year of the business register from 1974 through 2010. A big share of the business register on how we know a business is active in the business register comes from the fact that they filed a 941 form, a quarterly form, so we know how many employees and what their payroll was each quarter. That's the way that the Census Bureau knows whether or not you're even active in a year, so that we can send you a form. So, and then we're reusing that data, and using it in some cases when we sample, if we don't actually select you, we'll use your administrative data instead of the data that we collect. We collect data, but not for everyone. So it can be a mix of administrative and collective.
Would it also include Social Security and both in
It does on the demographic. So Social Security contributes on the demographic side, not really on the business side. And that's why there's that additional IRS review. The administrative data on the business side comes from the IRS, so they want to review the proposals and make sure that they're providing a Title 13 benefit. So.
Now, Dr. Zuma Valdez is going to